hydrated. Then, as they made efforts to treat him, he had a seizure. Further tests were carried out. These showed that the salt levels in the boy's body were extremely high. Normal blood contains around 140 millimoles of salt per litre, but in David's case the reading was 218 millimoles. Doctors were growing increasingly alarmed about his condition, and the efforts to treat him were becoming more frantic. As he began to lose consciousness, there was a desperate attempt at resuscitation, but he slipped into a second, deeper coma.
Well, when we got there, we realised how serious things were, and well, with Keith and Petrina there, we just threw our arms around them and tried to comfort them. They were so upset.
The next day, doctors faced two tasks: to reduce the excessive salt levels in David's blood and find out what had caused them.
We obviously looked at David's feeds after he collapsed, because a feed was going in at the time he did collapse. And when the feed was looked at, there were visible crystals which were thought to be salt in the feed.
Could these crystals finally explain the high levels of salt in David's blood?
There is no medical reason for additional salt to be added to the feeds. The feeds are complete and no added salt is required for them. Therefore, finding salt crystals in the feeds means that salt must have been added to the feeds by somebody.
Detectives at Hendon Police in North London were called in to investigate. Meanwhile, David's condition became critical.
I got into the hospital, and when I got there, David's grandmother, said to me that Keith and Petrina were actually in the office, and they were being told that they were going to switch the life support machine off.
On the 20th of August 2001, David died. His parents were told that the official cause of death was irreversible brain damage as a result of excessive sodium intake.
They were both completely devastated. We all were, and we were numb, absolutely numb, because David had been ill for so long, and just going down the whole time, and it was absolutely awful.
It was very, very surprising how quickly a little boy could go from even the situation where we'd seen him in the wheelchair to the situation that obviously we ended up at in such a short space of time. Yeah, it was very, very surprising.
The news of David's deterioration at Great Ormond Street and subsequent death was utter shock to all the staff, including me.
Keith and Petrina at that stage were just distraught. They were very, very, very distressed, in a state, obviously, of shock.
Petrina Stocker was devastated at the decline and death of her child.
But the high levels of salt in David's blood couldn't be overlooked, and the detectives were determined to find the cause.
I became involved in the David Stocker case when I was phoned up by some officers from the Metropolitan Police, and they told me about the case and asked if I could get involved by doing some analyses of samples which had been retrieved from where David was being cared for. Well, my first impressions of the case on reading the case notes was that David had been poisoned with salt. Nothing else seemed to fit. And what that will do is that essentially it will suck water out of the cells of the brain. And it also sucks it out of the cells of other parts of the body as well. But what happens when the water is sucked out of the cells of the brain is that they shrink.
The question was, how had excessive amounts of salt got into the milk feeds that were being given to David Stocker? And critically, who had put them there?
The concentration of sodium in your blood is probably at the moment around 140 millimoles per litre. Concentration in one of the bottles was 1708 millimoles per litre, a very high concentration. That's a lot of salt.
The feeds that David had were made up in the diet kitchen. They are a manufactured product and no added salt would have been added to them because they are complete in their own right. There is no possibility of that salt being added other than deliberately. There would have been no medical reason for salt to be added.
Armed with that knowledge, the police investigation of David's death changed. Great Ormond Street became the centre of a murder inquiry. The detectives leading the inquiry saw a pattern emerging. And it was a pattern that added weight to the early suspicions of hospital staff that David's own mother was involved.
Following David's death, Petrina Stocker became the #1 suspect because she had greatest access to him, because she was by his bedside as much as she could, consistent with the love and wishes of a mother. But that in turn, of course, raised the question, if she was being so closely watched, why was it that none of the staff actually saw her doing anything untoward?
We were all a bit numb at the time. We'd lost David, and there's all this going on. We were completely numb. And it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. We were all asleep, and there's this loud banging on the door. Well, I eventually got up. I could hear a lot of noise in the house. Petrina and Keith were staying with us at the time. You see, they couldn't face going home to a house without David there. They just couldn't face it. And we needed each other to help each other. And I remember getting up thinking, what's going on? And the first person I saw was Keith. I said, what's the matter? What's happening? He said, we're being arrested. And I just at the time, whatever for?
In September 2001, Petrina Stocker was arrested and taken in for questioning by police. She was later remanded on bail until the start of her trial in 2005. She had been charged with murdering her 9-year-old son, but her defense team believed there was little concrete evidence against her.
It was never actually seen, nor was it proven through direct evidence, observation evidence, that Petrina Stocker was contaminating her son's samples.
In Part 4, the trial of Petrina Stocker gets underway.
The ultimate question to be determined by the jury, which was who added salt to the feed of David Stocker, which killed him.
And David's death raises serious questions within the medical world.
This child had been looked after by different doctors in different hospitals over a longish period of time, and yet this poor child wasn't protected.
August 2001. David Stocker, a 9-year-old from Essex, has died in London's Great Ormond Street Hospital. This followed a mysterious illness that had seen him in and out of 2 hospitals for 8 months. But his death is highly suspicious. After the discovery that he's been poisoned with salt mixed into his hospital drip feeds, police are called in to investigate. Following a month of inquiries, they arrest David's mother, Petrina, and charge her with his murder. At the same time, serious questions regarding hospital policy are being raised.
This child had been looked after by different doctors in different hospitals over a longish period of time, and they had had their suspicions. They had reported those suspicions, as they have to social service departments, and yet this poor child wasn't protected.
It takes 3.5 years for the case to finally come to trial. The enormity of the investigation means police have to conduct interviews with 165 witnesses, and the different legal teams identify nearly 70 experts who can offer their own medical opinion. Eventually, the prosecution decide to pursue a charge of manslaughter rather than murder.
I don't believe that the Crown ever set out to prove that Petrina Stocker, during the months that he was ill and in both hospitals, was actually making her son physically ill. The suggestion that was being made was simply that she was interfering with his samples. The effect of that, of course, would be to hinder his recovery, which is somewhat different to making him ill.
On the 26th of November 2004, Petrina Stocker appeared at the Old Bailey charged with David's manslaughter. She pleaded not guilty, and her defence team insisted she was innocent.
A relatively large number of agencies were actually involved in the supervision of the Stockers. There was the nurses and the doctors and the police and the social services. They were all monitoring what was actually going on at the bedside of David Stocker. Well, under such close scrutiny, how could it be that if Mrs. Stocker was contaminating these samples, that simply was never noted?
During David's first admission to Great Ormond Street, there were concerns about the intravenous drip and also the pattern of blood in the urine, but at that time it was thought to be the sort of thing that does sometimes happen, and no great weight was put on that.
One of the things you have to remember is that When a child has complex, difficult to explain symptoms and they're sent to a hospital which specialises in rare disease, one of the tasks of that hospital is to investigate for every possible incredibly rare disease, and that's often a very time-consuming process. So one can understand that one of the criteria was to say, well, let's be sure we're not doing this family an injustice and that there isn't some very strange disease going on here, and one can understand that happening.
The defence always maintained that there was no hard evidence that she had contaminated any sample, interfered with any trip, nor had she been seen directly to do so. If it was being suggested that she was adding blood, for instance, to urine samples provided David, how was she doing it? When was it done?
The basis for the prosecution's case was to start with the evidence and work backwards. The evidence was that David had been killed by a massive salt overdose. The next question was whether this had been a deliberate act, and if so, who had added the salt.
We did a thorough investigation, obviously following David's collapse and tragic death. And as a result of that investigation and working very closely with the police, we had no reason whatsoever to think that the salt could have been added by a staff member.
In a nurse's locker, sometime later, was discovered a container of salt, about which little was done by the police in order to further their inquiry.
There was discussion in the court case, in the trial, that salt had been found in a nurse's locker. This wouldn't be necessarily that unusual because salt isn't terribly available on the ward, so if the nurse had wanted some with her meal break, then she might well have salt.
By a process of elimination and a lack of other credible suspects, the Crown argued that only David's mother could have added the salt. But why? According to the prosecution, the decision to move David to the rehabilitation psychiatric ward, where supervision was tighter, had given Petrina the motive she needed.
On a rehabilitation ward, it is not normal for parents to be around the child all the time.
By secretly adding salt to David's feed, Petrina made sure he'd remain sick and have to be kept on a medical ward, where she could remain close to him.
Petrina Stocker, we suggested at all times, wanted what was best for him. If there was a limitation upon visiting in the psychiatric ward, and his mother was not happy about that, it was simply because she believed that she would be directly responsible for his improvement, not his deterioration, and therefore she would want to be by his bedside as much as possible. The prosecution said such ambition was sinister.
But if David was being watched the whole time, then the salt must have been added before it reached his bedside.
At that time, just like other hospitals around the country, we did not have a lock on the fridge that the feeds were put into, and we weren't using tamper-proof tops for those bottles. The bottles sat in the fridge, obviously keeping cool, until the nurses needed to give David the feed. When they got to that point, then the feed would be taken round to David and connected up to a pump so that the feed could be given down his nose through a tube into his stomach.
The prosecution was able to prove that the salt that was put into David's feed, causing his death, must have been added in the diet kitchen of his ward. At this time, there were no surveillance or security systems in place, so the culprit would be able to go unnoticed. And the culprit, they maintained, was Petrina Stocker. The jury was also told of a previous incident some years earlier where Petrina had been suspected of tampering with her own urine sample by adding sugar to it.
Petrina Stocker's defence was that she simply was not responsible for the death of her child. Namely, she didn't do the act that led to the child's death, which was the addition of sodium, salt, to the child's feed. The defence simply relied upon a lifelong and age-old assertion, which was that this was for the prosecution to prove by admissible evidence that she was responsible for the death of the child through the administration of salt. And the state of the evidence being what it was, the defence always contended the prosecution couldn't do that.
But the jury were convinced. After hearing from 100